NASA astronauts are known for their boldness and courage as they travel into the unknown regions of space. However, even these brave individuals have experienced panic attacks and scary moments during missions. What kind of scary situations have these spacefarers been in? Have they witnessed some things that defy explanation? Join me today as we take a look at the scariest things said by NASA astronauts. Apollo 10. Let's discuss the strange radio blackout during the Apollo 10 mission. Astronauts John Young, Thomas Stafford, and Eugene Andrew Cernan described the blackout as the most terrifying experience of their lives. John Young was an American astronaut, naval officer, aviator, test pilot, and aeronautical engineer. Thomas Stafford is an American former Air Force officer, test pilot, and NASA astronaut. Eugene Andrew Cernan is an American astronaut, naval aviator, electrical engineer, aeronautical engineer, and fighter pilot. This eclipse occurred in 1969 during Snoopy's pre-flight preparations for the historic Apollo 11 moon landing mission. Eugene Cernan's primary goal for Snoopy was to fly near the surface of the moon without hitting it. Snoopy endures a near 1-hour blackout and loses all radio communications as soon as he loses sight of Earth and begins his perilous journey around the moon. The astronauts were alone and unable to communicate with other humans during this entire time. It was probably their loneliest time yet. Although Snoopy made it to the end of his journey and returned to Earth, you could tell that the astronauts had experienced something profound. Throughout the period, he was still in shock and described it as the most bizarre and disturbing thing he had ever encountered. It was the longest hour of his life because he could not see the ground and there was no communication. On the other hand, Eugene felt nothing but stillness, darkness, and anxiety in the spacecraft. At the time, the only thing separating them from absolute nothingness was a few inches of aluminum. The fact that for decades, no one has been able to determine why the radio signals went silent makes this mission to the moon all the more terrifying. Some believe that NASA deliberately shut down communication to hide the data as the crew encountered something unknown. Others, however, believe it had something to do with the moon itself, as it may have absorbed or reflected the radio signals. Naturally, there is no evidence that this is the case, but given how weak the moon's magnetic field is, the possibility that it caused the eclipse is also extremely unlikely. According to Thomas Stafford, commander of the Apollo 10 mission, it was the loneliest human experience. Although Thomas finished the mission just as well as Cernan, he also mentions that maintaining awareness of reality was the hardest part. His mind was too preoccupied with the feeling of being alone in space and wandered off every time he tried to concentrate on the task at hand. The realization that they were all alone would have dawned on him. What he had said was very disturbing, because if the blackout had lasted a few more hours, the crew could have lost their composure. This would have led to mission failure and casualties. Even more confusing, the astronauts heard a strange whistling noise as if it had been coming from the radio all along, even though they were not communicating with the flight control center at the time. Eugene Cernan says it was a strange sound from space, and at one point they weren't even sure if it was real or not. At the time, astronauts Buzz Aldrin, a former astronaut, engineer and fighter pilot, and Neil Armstrong, an American astronaut and aerospace engineer, were exploring the surface of the moon. Armstrong made history in 1969 by becoming the first man to set foot on the moon. Apollo 11, pilot number 10. Michael Collins also noticed the strange whistling sound. Michael Collins was the pilot of the Apollo 11 mission that took humans to the moon for the first time in 1969. Collins made just as significant a contribution to the voyage as his crewmates Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, though he never attracted much attention. Collins piloted the Columbia Command Module, spending nearly 28 hours in orbit alone as his colleagues Armstrong and Aldrin descended to the lunar surface. Fortunately, Collins heard the explanation earlier that the strange sound was probably radio interference, so he wasn't too worried. But Alfred Merrill Warden, an American test pilot, engineer, and NASA astronaut, disagreed with the idea of radio interference. He thought the whistling noise was coming from outside the spacecraft, so some astronauts heard the same strange sounds, and all concluded it was no ordinary radio problem. The deafening silence of space is frightening enough on its own, but the fact that astronauts report hearing a similar sound every time is absolutely terrifying. but what caused those sounds is still a bit of a mystery. Maurice Henderson. Maurice Henderson, who was a senior NASA official, has stated that he is certain that aliens are here and watching us, and that they have always been on Earth, since he has known of so many occurrences and encounters with them during his active years. After he retired, Henderson wrote several books that dealt primarily with the influence of extraterrestrials on the development of human civilization, and perhaps even the human race. In one of his works, he also claimed that 2 UFO craft hovered over astronauts Armstrong and Aldrin in the limited NASA film footage during their historic first moon landing. Morris checks out some photos that appeared in People magazine in June 1975, just minutes after Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon. Additionally, Neil Armstrong transmitted this radio broadcast, which is attributed to Apollo 11's landing on the moon. Armstrong makes a remark about the presence of other spacecraft on the moon. He said, "Oh my God, you wouldn't believe it if I told them there were other spacecraft here." And they are now gathered at the other end of the crater watching us. Even now, NASA disputes these reports about the moon landing and claims that Maurice Henderson was really an ineffective engineer working for a contractor and was never associated with the agency. However, Maurice believed all along that it was aliens. What he mentions regarding the Apollo moon flights is horrifying. After his retirement, he claimed that there was a lot of alien activity during the Apollo 11 mission. He adds that NASA even suppressed Neil Armstrong's statement. There were also pictures in magazines showing 2 UFO craft hovering as the first humans stepped on the moon. To this day, NASA denies Maurice's horrific claims and even released a statement saying he was never part of the Apollo missions. Maybe that's why NASA has avoided going to the moon for the longest time. However, speaking of strange alien spacecraft, what Gordon Cooper has seen is perhaps one of the greatest and most terrifying UFO sightings of all time. Extraterrestrial life. Gordon Cooper was an American aerospace engineer, test pilot, and USAF pilot who piloted Gemini 5 and Mercury 9. He claimed that in 1963, he saw a UFO fly right next to his capsule. He continually reported to flight control how the craft would appear and then disappear for a short time, only to come directly at him and finally slow down to his capsule. Gordon Cooper claims to have had a clear view of the ship for over 10 minutes, even when it descended to a lower altitude. The UFO craft continued to follow him until it had receded into deep space at unimaginable speed. Gordon's theory of extraterrestrial life has drawn criticism from several prominent scientific groups. The terrifying thing about the 1963 event is that the UFO was even detected by radar, leaving everyone baffled and without any explanation. He subsequently reveals that NASA has a strict policy regarding the discussion of UFOs and aliens. It is as simple as this: if you're an astronaut and you happen to see something strange, you can't discuss it. Cooper was lucky though, as this was not his first encounter with a UFO. Cooper claims to have seen an entire fleet of alien craft right in front of him while serving as a pilot in the Air Force in 1984. During an interview with NBC News, he said that humans were backpedaling if they believed they were the only intelligent species in space. "I think if we look properly, we will probably find evidence of alien life in the solar system." In 2001, Cooper stated on Larry King's program that alien vehicles and their personnel from other worlds have been visiting Earth for centuries. To this day, he is criticized for his disturbing theories about extraterrestrial life, which may explain why they have always been viewed with suspicion. Number 7. Dr. Franklin, a Musgrave story. Dr. Franklin Musgrave, considered by experts to be a professor of space, holds a unique status. No one so highly educated and famous has flown in space before or since. He was involved in 6 space missions, the most notable being Apollo 15. Dr. Musgrave, who holds university degrees in 6 different fields, has made a strange statement. He saw a white flap about 3 meters long floating in space outside the windows of the space shuttle. When he returned, NASA said it was probably a component that had broken off from the rocket or space capsule. Musgrave, however, disagreed with that interpretation, especially after seeing the same thing again. This time, it was much larger and looked like a snake, measuring between 6 and 8 meters. However, referring to snakes as alien life only adds to the controversy and scare surrounding humans. Maybe they are just organisms, similar to us, formed in space from a mixture or whatever. That's Dr. Musgrave's opinion. Known as the Professor of Cosmonautics, he is perhaps the most learned man to visit the planet. However, his remarks about snakes and alien societies were truly horrifying. Dr. Musgrave has stated that he saw space snakes twice during his travels. However, he is still unable to identify the objects he sees, even though their skin has a texture like rubber. Even more terrifying is his account that the snakes followed his plane for hours before finally slithering out into the night. Incredibly, the images of the snake-like organisms were taken during NASA's STS-61 mission. Although Dr. Musgrave believes it to be a living being, there are ideas that suggest it may be some kind of advanced alien spacecraft designed specifically for space travel. But strange and terrifying creatures abound in space. Since his work at NASA, Dr. Musgrave has stated in several interviews and reports that these encounters are evidence of extraterrestrial life. He claims that these civilizations, which have been on Earth for at least 100 million years, are significantly more advanced than our own. However, it appeared that his chances of success were slim as he continued his research by trying to talk to these aliens and inviting them to come to him. Even if that seems unlikely, it only serves to highlight the fact that some of the most experienced astronauts have faith in extraterrestrial life.